listeners of the Bio Report, I want to tell you about a new member benefit from the California Technology Council. CTC has teamed with Reprivada to offer members 6 months of Reprivada's COT network service for free, which gives companies the power of a VPN at a fraction of the cost. A remote, flexible workforce is the new normal, but most corporate networks aren't built to accommodate work from home at scale. Reprivada's COT network offers an easily deployable, affordable, and scalable solution to securely enable remote workers and protect the corporate network. To learn more about this and other member benefits, go to californiatechnology.org/member benefits. I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. People with the rare and fatal genetic condition, spinal muscular atrophy, in recent years have seen the approval of an antisense therapy as well as a gene therapy. Genentech has now won U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval for Evrysdi, the first oral at-home treatment for the condition. We spoke to Levi Garraway, Chief Medical Officer and Head of Global Product Development at Genentech, about Evrysdi, how it works, and how it fits into the choices physicians and patients have when it comes to treating spinal muscular atrophy. Levi, thanks for joining us.
Danny, thank you for having me.
We're going to talk about spinal muscular atrophy, the recent approval of Genentech's Evrysdi, which is the first oral at-home therapy, and what this means for patients with the condition. Let's start with spinal muscular atrophy, though. What is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Danny, really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this. So spinal muscular atrophy, we use SMA for short. It's a neuromuscular disease. It's actually quite severe and progressive. In fact, it's the leading genetic cause of infant mortality. And so SMA affects approximately 1 in 10,000 babies. So this disease is caused by a mutation in a gene called SMN1. It means survival motor neuron 1. So it's a mouthful. But that mutation causes a deficiency of the protein, the SMN protein. And this is a problem because that protein is required for the proper function of nerves that control our muscles and therefore our movement. So without proper SMN protein function, those nerve cells, they don't work well, and eventually they can become lost over time. And that leads to progressive muscle weakness. And as you might imagine, in the fullness of time, that weakness will affect someone's ability to move their limbs, to eat, to breathe on their own. And depending on the severity, some people may eventually require constant caregiver support for daily activities, even as simple as getting dressed, brushing their teeth, going to the bathroom, etc. So overall, people with SMA, they lose their ability to perform critical muscle movements, and that can often impact their ability to participate independently in activities of daily living and may become debilitating.
We've seen new treatments emerge for patients with SMA. What's the prognosis for patients today?
Well, so certainly, as I mentioned earlier, SMA remains a severe progressive disease. It can be fatal, in fact. And yes, there have been recent advancements, but despite those advancements, the majority of people in the U.S. with SMA, so let's say 60% or so, still aren't treated at all. And so therefore, there has remained a need for continued innovation for new therapies. And so, as I mentioned, throughout their lives, you still have this progressive ability potentially to lose critical movements. And so that's why we're excited about Evrysdi, which we think it's first of a kind mechanism, it's at home delivery, it's oral dosing. All of those things represent important advancements in treatment options for patients with SMA.
And how does Evrysdi work?
So as I mentioned, Evrysdi, it's the first at-home treatment for SMA to be FDA approved. It's actually approved for adults as well as children who are 2 months of age or older. And the way that it works, the technical term is it's called a splicing modifier. So I described the SMN protein. And I mentioned that the primary problem for patients with SMA is a mutation in a gene called SMN1. It turns out that so they've lost the SMN function, but there's a second gene called SMN2 that can make a related form of the protein, but most of that protein it doesn't come together properly, so it can't rescue, it can't serve the purpose of SMN1. But what Evrysdi does is it causes a specific form of the SMN2 function to be expressed, which actually can rescue. It can substitute for SMN1. So you now have what we call a functional rescue. You have a different variation of SMN protein that can do the job that the SMN1 protein was supposed to do. And so if you do that, if you can increase the levels of that version of SMN2 in nerve cells and in other cells in the body, you can help restore the function of those nerve cells and thereby maybe preserve or improve movement for patients who have this mutation. So we studied Evrysdi. That was the idea, and we studied it in a robust clinical trial program across a spectrum of people with varying ages and diseases, and levels of disease severity. And obviously, we're thrilled to have the result of FDA approval.
How much of a technical challenge was it developing an oral therapy for this condition? Does it need to cross the blood-brain barrier? Is that an issue?
Yeah, the challenge goes back to our partners at a company called PTC Therapeutics, who came up with the idea of coming up with a therapy that would rescue the role of a protein that had been lost. I mean, if you think about it, a lot of medicines that are made, what they're designed to do is to block. They're designed to inhibit the abnormal function of a protein. So this medicine was designed to, in some ways, do the opposite. It was designed to restore the function of a protein that had been lost. So that was a big challenge. And then, as you mentioned, there were the series of challenges that one always has to make a medicine that works selectively to do that, which is safe, and then which can get to the cells of the body where the effect is needed. So we're very proud of the efforts that were taken not only by our teams to develop the medicine, but the collaboration with the SMA community so that together we could come up with an advance that could be given to patients at home, given to them orally, and given to patients across the spectrum of disease.
This is an area of rare disease that's seen enormous innovation. I understand Evrysdi has the potential to treat a broader range of patients, though, than Spinraza, which is the antisense therapy, or Zolgensma, the gene therapy that's targeting SMA. How does Evrysdi fit into the treatment options available today?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this certainly the past few years have certainly been a hopeful time for the entire SMA community, because during that interval, that community went from having no approved treatment options to now having 3 approved treatment options. And so, as you mentioned, what Evrysdi now gives is an option that, whereas in the past they may have had to visit healthcare providers to be given a treatment, with Evrysdi, an effective treatment can now be administered in their own homes because it can be given orally. And by the way, that's particularly important now because Evrysdi comes at a time when access to treatment is more critical than ever, given that we're navigating the pandemic. So as you also alluded to, we studied Evrysdi in a clinical trial program that represented not just babies with SMA, but children and people of varying ages, including into adulthood, and also with varying stages of severity. And so so a key point there is that this program is the first that included patient groups that previously were not really well represented in clinical research of medicines for SMA, and that includes older infants, children, even people over the age of 18. And then also it included people who had, in some cases, been previously treated for SMA with another medication. So really, together, these data support the role of Evrysdi in many different settings, including a large setting of people who really never had an optimal treatment option in the past.
Well, what have the studies shown in terms of its safety and efficacy?
Yeah, great question. So in infants, so one study, or one set of studies, which we called Firefish, showed that, for example, in infants, Evrysdi was often able to achieve an ability to sit without support for at least 5 seconds. That's a motor milestone that's often looked at. It's not normally seen in the natural course of the disease. And actually, so that was the primary goal of the Firefish study, was to measure whether or not infants could sit without support. But Evrysdi did a number of other things as well. For example, it improved the survival time without the need for permanent ventilation in infants with the most severe form of the disease, again, compared to the natural history. And then there were a number of other movement-related improvements that were measured, where also Evrysdi showed benefits. So that's one setting where we saw some significant and clinically meaningful benefits. And then in another setting, we studied children and adults, so older patients with Evrysdi, and there too we saw clinically meaningful and, of course, statistically significant improvements in motor function. And there were a variety of ways in which that was measured, and that was compared to patients who were not treated. So in summary, across the board, we've seen improved motor function in people with varying ages and levels of disease severity with Evrysdi.
Does this just slow progression, or does it actually reverse the disease?
So in some cases, we see improvements to the point of, so for example, in the Firefish study, some of the measurements that we use for movement, initially, they essentially bring babies to a point of development that's kind of close to normal. Now, obviously, we have to wait. Our studies are ongoing, so we can see how durable those benefits are. But some of the measurements and the improvements that we're seeing were really quite significant. In older individuals, for example, adolescents, adults, what tended to be seen was more of a stabilization. But that obviously it still matters to people who are afflicted with this disease and who are normally going through a progressive state. So I think depending on how old you are, depends on the kind of benefit you get, which is not surprising, because of course, if you've lived long enough with the disease and a lot of motor nerve cells have already died out, of course, what Evrysdi is not restoring those nerve cells. What it's doing is, for the nerve cells that are there, it's helping them function properly. So, but you can easily imagine why there's benefit kind of across the board, but the extent of benefit may be greater the younger you are.
How novel an approach is the mechanism of action here, and does it suggest a way to get at other genetic diseases?
Yeah, so certainly this idea of an oral medicine that can restore a proper function of protein, that certainly is something that, certainly for SMA, it's first of its kind. And we do hope that there may be other opportunities for other kinds of diseases, perhaps other rare diseases, where one could think about that kind of approach. This is very exciting for patients with SMA, but also just in general for medical innovation.
Spinraza requires regular intrathecal delivery. This is an injection of the drug into the spine in a hospital setting. What's the implication for patients of having an oral at-home therapy?
Well, certainly, as we were discussing earlier, the approval of Evrysdi, in general, this at-home delivery, it's an important advancement because this is a first of its kind compared to even the recent therapeutics. Offering, so it's an effective medicine, it's a safe medicine, and it doesn't require patients to make regular visits to the clinic. They can administer it in their own homes. So we do think this is an important advance. We're proud, actually, to bring a groundbreaking medicine like this that can be administered at home, now during the pandemic, and of course, in the future. And it meets some key needs of people who live with this disorder kind of across the board, children and even adults, and not just infants.
Does the delivery of the drug have an implication on how it's reimbursed?
Yeah, great question. So as you know, out-of-pocket costs for patients are determined by many factors. They can include insurance coverage, the benefit design of their insurance. So there's not a single answer to that question. What I can say, though, is that at Genentech, we're certainly committed to ensuring that our medicines get to the people who need them, even if they can't afford them. And so we have a team of people at Genentech who are dedicated to helping people who have trouble accessing our medicines, or more generally, who have insurance coverage or reimbursement issues. And in the specific case of SMA, the program is called the My SMA Support Program. And so there's a team that basically are there to answer questions and provide educations and basically help families navigate questions related to insurance coverage and financial assistance options so that they can start and stay on Evrysdi.
What is the pricing plan for Evrysdi?
Yeah, so for the pricing, we of course considered a number of factors, and we also had input from the SMA community on this question. And so the decisions were really around the intention to enable access, and also, of course, to help a broad range of people with SMA to have access to Evrysdi. So the overall schema is based on a child's weight until they reach 20 kilograms, which is about 44 pounds, which usually occurs at about 6 years of age. So before they get to 20 kilograms, it's a weight-based dosing regimen, and then once they reach 20 kilograms, it's a flat dose thereafter. But getting back to the specific pricing question, so as an example, for an infant who weighs 15 pounds, which was the average weight in our Firefish study, and who is less than 2 years old, the annual wholesale acquisition cost of Evrysdi would be less than $100,000, and so we can talk about how that compares to other therapies, but that would be the rough ballpark for an infant, and then we have a weight-based dosing regimen around that. But again, Genentech is always committed to ensuring that our medicines can get to people who need them, even if they can't afford them. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a team of people who help navigate those issues.
Well, what have the discussions with payers been like to date?
Yeah, so as you might imagine, we've been working with a large range of payers across the U.S. To ensure coverage, commercial, Medicaid, and Medicare coverage of Evrysdi. And so as we secure individual agreements, we can provide specific guidance to patients and, of course, the payers that are covering patients. But obviously, we will continue to work very closely with patients and payers to minimize gaps in access to Evrysdi. So, as I mentioned earlier, so this is an ongoing process, but we have the My SMA Support Program, which is really there not only to navigate the process, but to answer the questions that may come from patients or their providers or insurance companies around that.
Certainly seen other indications where the entry of lower priced alternatives have had a dramatic impact on the pricing of other drugs. Are you seeing any movement by other makers to reduce their prices in response to the introduction of this?
Yeah, great question. So it's still early, what we can say is that the annual wholesale acquisition cost that I kind of referred to earlier of Evrysdi is well below the cost of other available SMA therapies. So for a patient who'd be on the maximum dose, I gave an example of an infant before, but if for a patient who would be on the maximum dose, we estimate that wholesale acquisition cost would be about $340,000. And by way of context, that's 25% less than the 5-year average of a patient who is starting on current standard of care for SMA. And Evrysdi is also priced below the annualized cost. If you think about, over a 5-year period, the annualized cost of gene therapy, that cost would be about $425,000 a year over 5 years. So the annual wholesale acquisition cost of Evrysdi is well below the cost of both gene therapy and other standard of care regimens. Now, obviously, there are no head-to-head clinical trials between SMA and SMA therapy, so efficacy comparisons should not be made. But certainly, we think that that the pricing components here of Evrysdi will compare favorably to other available therapies for SMA.
One of the frustrations within the rare disease community is the large number of conditions, something on the order of 95%, that have no approved FDA therapy available. It's interesting to see pipelines of therapies by various drug developers going after the same indication at the same time. It's certainly good news for people with the condition, but I'm curious, as a drug developer thinks about business decisions, how does that affect whether they decide to pursue a potential therapy? And is it just the advancement of science in a specific condition that moves multiple therapies through the pipeline at the same time, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you think about the impact that a new therapy could have, you can think about it a couple of different ways. One, of course, is, well, how many people in the world have the disease? But the other is, what is the magnitude of benefit you can bring to people with the disease? And so even if a disease is less common, if you have a therapeutic advance that has the potential to bring a substantial benefit to patients with the disease that haven't had any or maybe have had very few options in the past, the feeling is that kind of benefit for people, things usually work out from a business standpoint. So therefore, and I think it's quite inspiring, I think, for people like myself and others who work at Genentech and other companies who are really dedicated to the idea of bringing groundbreaking new treatments to people, because regardless of the size of the number of people with disease in the country, if you can make a substantial advance, then right now in this country we have an ability to bring those advances to people and trust that the business will work itself out.
And what's the value case to make for Evrysdi? How should patients or physicians think about it when considering their options today?
Yeah, great question. I think it really comes back to these key elements of that, especially we're navigating a pandemic and patients patient safety is so key. And so we have now a treatment option with a favorable efficacy and safety profile that can be administered in their own homes. And it's also now an opportunity for patients with the disease that have historically not necessarily been candidates for some of the other therapies. And so that at-home delivery, oral dosing, and broad sort of patient population in our clinical program, we think that's a value case that will be appealing for a lot of people with SMA.
Levi Garraway, Chief Medical Officer and Head of Global Product Development at Genentech. Levi, thanks so much for your time today.
Danny, thanks again for hosting me.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, Subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.